The rain fell in unrelenting sheets, turning the ground beneath Captain Luke Shaw into a mire of mud and despair. He crouched low behind a jagged outcrop of rock, the chill of the storm seeping through his battered armor. His breath fogged in the damp air as he peered through his scope at the alien ship hovering above the ruined outpost. Its metallic hull shimmered faintly, an otherworldly silver that seemed to repel even the light of the planet's twin moons. It was a predator in the sky, silent and untouchable. The voice crackling through his earpiece was strained, barely audible over the rain. "Captain, Outpost 7 is gone. They're everywhere. We can't hold them off." Luke pressed a gloved hand to his ear, his jaw tightening. "Stay calm, Lieutenant Thomas. Fall back to the secondary position. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." The transmission dissolved into static, and Luke lowered his hand, his gaze never leaving the alien vessel. It had been 3 days since the Galactic Empire's fleet had descended on Tiberius, and the humans had been on the defensive ever since. The ships were impervious to their weapons, their energy shields absorbing every missile and bullet with a mocking indifference. Entire battalions had been wiped out in minutes, and the survivors were scattered, reduced to guerrilla tactics in the planet's endless rain-soaked wilderness. Behind him, Lieutenant Caleb Thomas huddled in the mud, his rifle cradled against his chest. He wiped a hand across his rain-slicked face, his expression grim. "You think they know we're here? They would have killed us already if they did," Luke replied, his voice low. "But stay ready. They're not the type to miss anything for long." A few feet away, Sergeant Lucas Hernandez shifted uncomfortably, his youthful face pale under the streaks of mud. He couldn't seem to keep his hand steady on his weapon. "Do you think we can take one of those things down, sir? Even just one?" Luke glanced back at him, his expression unreadable. "Focus on surviving first, Sergeant. Everything else comes later." A sudden flare of light from the ship made all 3 men freeze. The vessel tilted slightly, its underside glowing faintly as it began to descend. Luke gestured sharply for the others to stay down, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship landed with an eerie grace, its landing struts sinking slightly into the muddy ground. A ramp extended from its side, and a figure emerged, tall, clad in armor that gleamed even in the storm. Luke's grip tightened on his rifle. He had seen these beings before in reports. The Empire's enforcers, cold and efficient, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. This one held a device in its hand, scanning the area methodically. "We need to move," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Slowly, and a sharp crack echoed through the air. Luke turned just in time to see Lucas lowering his rifle, his eyes wide with panic. The shot had gone wide, striking a rock near the alien. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the enforcer raised its arm, and a pulse of energy shot out, obliterating the rock and sending shards flying. "Run!" Luke barked, dragging Lucas to his feet as the alien ship began to hum ominously. The trio sprinted through the mud, slipping and stumbling as the ground trembled beneath them. Behind them, the ship's weapons unleashed a torrent of fire, lighting up the stormy sky. The world became a blur of rain and chaos. Luke could hear Caleb cursing under his breath, could feel Lucas's panicked breaths beside him. The ship's fire tore through the terrain, carving deep scars into the earth. They reached the cover of a dense thicket of trees, and Luke signaled for them to stop. They collapsed against the trunks, gasping for breath. The ship hovered nearby, its searchlights sweeping the area. Luke pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence. The beam of light passed over their hiding spot, then moved on. After what felt like an eternity, the ship ascended, its hum fading into the distance. Lucas let out a shaky breath, his hands still trembling. I didn't mean to." "Enough!" Luke cut him off, his voice harsh. "You fired. We deal with it. No excuses." Lucas nodded, his face flushed with shame. Caleb placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softer. "We're all scared, kid. Just don't let it get you killed." Luke turned his attention back to the field, his mind racing. In the chaos, he had noticed something strange. When the ship's weapons had fired, the mud around it had reacted in an unusual way, almost as if the terrain itself was fighting back. "Did you see that?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to the others. "See what?" Caleb asked, frowning. "The mud," Luke said, his eyes narrowing. "It shifted, almost like it absorbed some of the energy." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You think the rain and mud can hurt their ships?" "That's a stretch. Even for you, Captain." Luke didn't respond immediately. His mind was already working, piecing together fragments of information. The alien ships were nearly invincible, but every machine had its limits, its vulnerabilities. Maybe, just maybe, this planet held the key to finding theirs. He stood, wiping the mud from his gloves. "We need to regroup with the others. There's something here, something we're missing, and I think it might be our only chance." Caleb pushed himself to his feet, his skepticism clear but unspoken. Lucas followed, his movements hesitant but determined. The three of them disappeared into the rain-soaked night, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. Above them, the alien ship lingered for a moment longer, its searchlights cutting through the darkness. Then it rose higher, its engines humming like a distant thunder. Luke didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. All he could do was move forward, driven by the faint hope that humanity's survival might still lie within reach. The rain showed no signs of letting up as Luke led his small team through the drenched grasslands, each step a battle against the sucking mud. Their boots squelched loudly, and the storm seemed to amplify every sound, but they pushed forward, driven by the need to regroup with the scattered remnants of their forces. The silence between the three men was heavy, broken only by the occasional crack of distant thunder. Lucas limped slightly, his face pale but determined as he kept pace. His earlier panic weighed on him visibly, the shame still etched into his features. Caleb, walking just behind him, kept a wary eye on their surroundings, his rifle held close. Luke didn't need to glance back to know the man was exhausted. He could hear it in his labored breathing, but Caleb wouldn't complain. He never did. They reached the edge of a shallow ravine, its sides slick with mud. Luke raised a hand, signaling for the others to stop. He scanned the area, his sharp eyes searching for any signs of movement. The alien ships had been thorough in their sweep of the region, and there was little left of the human outposts. The smoldering remains of a nearby communications tower stood as a grim reminder of the carnage. "Think anyone made it out of here?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice tinged with doubt. "If they did, they'll be heading to the fallback point," Luke replied, keeping his voice low. "We just have to hope they got the message before this place was hit." Lucas crouched by the edge of the ravine, his gaze distant. "Sir, do you think we can really fight them? I mean, they've taken down everything we've thrown at them. How are we supposed to stop that?" Luke knelt beside him, his tone steady. "We don't stop. That's how. Every time we fall back, every time we regroup, we're still here. As long as we're alive, there's a chance." Lucas nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Caleb gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. Leave it to the captain to turn stubbornness into a survival strategy. Luke allowed himself a faint smirk, but said nothing. He stood, motioning for the others to follow. They descended into the ravine, the mud threatening to pull them under with every step. At the bottom, the faint outline of a hidden bunker came into view, half buried in the muck. The door creaked open after a tense knock sequence, and a pair of weary soldiers greeted them, their faces lighting up at the sight of Luke. Inside, the bunker was cramped but dry, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and sweat. A small group of survivors huddled around a flickering lantern, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. Captain Shaw, one of the soldiers, Corporal Dean Wallace, said, straightening as Luke entered, We thought you didn't make it." "Close enough," Luke replied grimly, scanning the room. "How many do we have?" 14, sir, including you three, Dean said, his expression darkening. We've lost contact with the other outposts. As far as we know, we might be all that's left. The weight of the words settled over the room like a shroud. Luke took a moment to let the grim reality sink in before speaking. Then we make this count. If we're all that's left, it's on us to figure out how to hit back. Caleb leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. And how exactly do we do that? Those ships are indestructible. And even if we could touch them, they'd turn us into ash before we had a chance. We've been looking at it all wrong, Luke said, his voice firm. Those ships aren't invincible. They can be brought down. A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. Luke stepped forward, addressing the group. When we were under fire earlier, I noticed something. The way the energy interacted with the terrain, it wasn't perfect. The mud, the rain, it seemed to disrupt their systems, even if only slightly. It's not much, but it's something. Dean frowned, his brow furrowing. You're saying the planet itself might be a weapon? Not a weapon, Luke corrected, but a tool. Every machine has its limits, even theirs. We just have to find a way to exploit them. Caleb raised an eyebrow. And how do we do that without getting ourselves killed? Luke glanced at the battered remains of a human anti-aircraft cannon tucked in the corner of the bunker. Its barrel was bent and its wiring frayed, but it was still intact enough to serve a purpose. We modify it, change the frequency of the rounds, adjust for the atmospheric conditions. If we can sync it with what I saw out there, we might have a chance to break through their shields. The room fell silent as the weight of his plans sank in. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the first glimmer of hope they'd had since the invasion began. Dean hesitated, then nodded. It's risky, but I'll take risky over hopeless any day. Caleb clapped him on the back, a faint grin tugging at his lips. That's the spirit. Let's hope you're as good at improvising as you are at surviving, Captain. Lucas stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. What do you need us to do, sir? Luke looked around the room, his gaze meeting each soldier's in turn. We need to move fast. Strip down any tech we can find, anything that might help us retrofit that cannon. Work in pairs and stay sharp. The moment they realize we're still here, they'll come for us. The group sprang into action, the bunker buzzing with a newfound energy. Luke worked alongside them, his mind focused on the task at hand. Caleb's sarcasm turned into a steady stream of commentary as he scavenged parts, while Lucas threw himself into the work with a determination that bordered on desperation. Hours passed, and the rain outside intensified, pounding against the bunker's reinforced walls. The modified cannon slowly took shape, a patchwork of salvaged components and hastily assembled wiring. Luke's hands moved with precision, his engineering background coming back to him like muscle memory. As he tightened the final bolt, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. The cannon looked crude, held together by little more than determination and duct tape, but it was ready. Dean approached, his expression a mix of apprehension and hope. Do you really think this'll work? Luke glanced at the cannon, then at the soldiers gathered around him. I don't know, but it's better than doing nothing. The storm outside roared louder, as if the planet itself was preparing for the battle to come. Luke looked at his team, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the lantern. They were tired, battered, and outnumbered, but they were still standing. We have one shot at this, he said, his voice firm. If this works, we might just give humanity a fighting chance. If it doesn't, Caleb smirked, his tone light despite the tension. Then at least we go out swinging. The group chuckled softly, the moment of levity cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. Luke allowed himself a faint smile, then turned back to the cannon. Get some rest, he said. We strike at dawn. The soldiers settled into their makeshift quarters, the weight of the coming battle heavy in the air. Luke remained by the cannon, his mind racing with calculations and contingencies. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a relentless reminder of the planet's unforgiving nature. As the first hints of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, Luke felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. Around him, the soldiers moved with quiet determination, their faces set in grim resolve. Caleb crouched by the cannon, his hands working deftly to adjust the final settings. Lucas was a few meters away, scanning the skies with a pair of binoculars, his body tense with anticipation. Dean stood by Luke's side, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his jaw tight. "It's a hell of a gamble, Captain," Dean said, his voice low. "If this doesn't work—" "It will." Luke cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "It has to." The faint hum of an approaching ship reached them then, a sound that sent a shiver down Luke's spine. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The predatory whisper of the Empire's enforcers. Luke raised a hand, signaling for silence. Lucas's voice came through the calm, hushed but urgent. "We've got movement. One ship, low altitude. Heading straight for us." Luke nodded, his heart pounding. "This is it." Everyone to their positions. The soldiers spread out, each taking cover behind the uneven terrain of the ravine. The cannon, its barrel angled toward the sky, stood as their last hope. Caleb gave Luke a quick thumbs up from his spot behind the makeshift controls, his expression serious but confident. The ship appeared moments later, breaking through the clouds with the same eerie grace that had unnerved them all since the invasion began. Its sleek, silver hull gleamed dully in the dim light, its engines emitting a low, pulsating hum. It hovered above the ravine, its searchlights sweeping the ground below. Luke gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. "Wait for my signal," he said over the comm. "We only get one shot at this." The ship descended slowly, its shield shimmering faintly as it drew closer to the ground. Luke's mind raced, calculating angles and trajectories. The rain slicked his face, but he barely noticed, his focus entirely on the target. The cannon fired. The sound was deafening, a thunderous roar that echoed through the ravine and seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The modified round tore through the air, its trajectory precise, its energy adjusted to match the planet's unique atmospheric conditions. For a split second, nothing happened. The ship's shields flared brightly, absorbing the impact as they had with every other attack. But then, something changed. The shields faltered. A ripple spread across the ship's surface, distorting the air around it. Sparks flew from its hull as the energy field collapsed, leaving the vessel exposed for the first time. The soldiers froze, their disbelief mirrored in their wide eyes. Luke didn't hesitate. "Now! Hit it with everything you've got." Gunfire erupted from every direction as the soldiers opened fire, their bullets tearing into the ship's unprotected hull. The alien vessel shuddered under the assault, its engine sputtering and its movements erratic. Caleb whooped loudly, his voice filled with a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. "It's working. We're actually doing it." The ship retaliated, its weapons unleashing a torrent of energy that ripped through the ravine. The ground shook violently, and Luke was thrown backward, landing hard in the mud. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. "Hold your ground," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "We can't let up now." Dean was firing steadily from his position, his face set in grim determination. Lucas had taken cover behind a boulder, his shots precise and deliberate. Caleb continued to man the cannon, reloading it with shaky hands as the ship's fire rained down around him. The alien vessel began to descend, smoke pouring from its damaged engines. Its movements grew more erratic, its weapons firing blindly as if in desperation. Luke could feel the tide turning, the fragile hope that had carried them this far solidifying into something stronger. But the battle wasn't over yet. A sudden burst of energy from the ship's underside sent debris flying in every direction. Luke hit the ground, shielding his head as a wave of heat washed over him. When he looked up, he saw Caleb sprawled on the ground unmoving. "Caleb!" Luke shouted, crawling toward him. Caleb groaned, pushing himself up with visible effort. Blood trickled down the side of his face, but he managed a weak grin. "Still here, Captain. You're not getting rid of me that easily." Luke helped him to his feet, relief flooding through him. "Stay down. We're almost there." The ship was barely holding itself together now, its once imposing frame reduced to a smoking, sparking wreck. Luke grabbed his comm, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Lucas, finish it. Aim for the engines." Lucas nodded from his position, adjusting his aim. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and fired. The shot hit its mark. The ship's engines exploded in a brilliant flash of light, and the vessel plummeted to the ground with a deafening crash. A shockwave rippled through the ravine, knocking everyone off their feet. For a moment, there was silence. The rain continued to fall, but it felt muted, distant. Luke pushed himself up, his body aching and his ears ringing. He looked around, his heart pounding. The ship lay in ruins, its once impenetrable hull now a twisted heap of metal. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, and sparks danced in the air like fireflies. A cheer erupted from the soldiers, their voices hoarse but triumphant. Caleb clapped Luke on the back, his grin wide despite the blood on his face. "We did it, Captain. We actually did it." Luke allowed himself a small smile, though his mind was already racing. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The Empire would know what they had done, and they would retaliate. He looked at the soldiers around him, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and determination. They had defied the odds, proven that the Empire wasn't invincible. The wreckage of the alien ship smoldered in the distance, a jagged mass of twisted metal and scorched earth. Luke stood at the edge of the impact site, the rain washing away streaks of mud from his face. The euphoria of their victory had quickly faded, replaced by the heavy weight of what came next. This wasn't the end. If anything, it was the beginning of a larger, deadlier game. Lucas approached him cautiously, his rifle slung over his back. His face was pale, his features tight with exhaustion, but his eyes held a flicker of pride. "Captain, what now? They'll come for us. You know that, right?" Luke nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "They will. But this gives us something we didn't have before, proof. We brought one down. We'll figure out how to do it again." Behind them, Caleb was sitting on a boulder, wrapping a makeshift bandage around his leg. He winced as he pulled it tight but managed a crooked smile when Luke glanced his way. "Hell of a first round, huh?" "I'd say we made a pretty good case for humanity not rolling over and dying." "Don't celebrate too soon," Luke replied, though there was a faint hint of amusement in his voice. "We're still deep in their territory, and reinforcements could already be on the way." Dean joined them, his expression grim. "He's right. We've got to assume this was just the beginning. If the Empire didn't know we were still a threat, they sure as hell do now." The radio crackled to life, a burst of static cutting through the damp air. Luke grabbed the device, his heart leaping at the sound of a familiar voice. "This is Major Rogers." "Repeat, this is Major Rogers." "Anyone out there, respond." Luke pressed a button, his voice steady despite the surge of relief. "This is Captain Shaw. We're here, Major. What's your status?" There was a brief pause, then a reply. "Captain Shaw, good to hear your voice. We've regrouped at an old mining facility about 20 clicks west of your position. Got about 30 survivors with me. How many do you have?" 14, Luke replied. "We've just taken down one of their ships. Modified our AA tech to pierce their shields." Rogers's voice sharpened. "You brought one down? Damn good work, Shaw. That changes things. Get your people here as fast as you can. We'll need to pool resources if we're going to turn this into something bigger." "Understood. We're on our way," Luke said before cutting the transmission. He turned to the others, his voice firm. "We move west. Now, there's a larger group holding out at a mining facility. We link up with them, share what we've learned, and prepare for the next attack." The soldiers gathered what supplies they could, their movements quick and efficient despite their fatigue. The rain continued to fall as they set out, the muddy terrain slowing their progress but not their resolve. The journey was tense, every shadow and sound a potential threat. The group moved in silence, their weapons at the ready, their senses heightened. Caleb, despite his injury, kept pace with a determined grimace. Lucas stayed close to Luke, his youthful energy tempered by the weight of the battle they'd just fought. It was just past midday when they reached the mining facility, its hulking structures rising out of the mist like ghosts. The remnants of humanity's past industry stood as a stark contrast to the sleek, alien technology that had invaded their world. Guards stationed at the entrance waved them through, their faces lighting up at the sight of reinforcements. Inside, the survivors had turned the facility into a makeshift stronghold. Crates of salvage supplies were stacked high, and a large map of the region was pinned to one wall, marked with notes and hastily drawn lines. Major Rogers, a grizzled man with a sharp gaze and a commanding presence, met them in the central chamber. He clasped Luke's hand firmly, his expression one of gratitude and respect. "Captain, damn fine work out there," Rogers said. "You've given us something we've been sorely lacking. Hope." Luke nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "We're not done yet, Major. They'll be coming for us, and they'll hit hard. We need to be ready." Rogers gestured to the map. "We've been tracking their movements as best we can. If your team's modifications can be replicated, we might stand a chance of holding this position." Lucas stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Sir, we can help with that. We scavenged parts from the wreckage of the ship we took down. It's not much, but it might give us a better understanding of their tech." Rogers raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Good thinking. Get it to our engineers. Time's not on our side." As the soldiers set to work, the atmosphere in the facility buzzed with a mixture of urgency and determination. Luke found a moment of quiet amidst the chaos, his thoughts racing as he considered their next move. The respite didn't last long. A distant rumble shook the ground, followed by a low, guttural hum that sent a chill down Luke's spine. He sprinted to the observation deck, his heart sinking at the sight of 3 alien ships cutting through the clouds, their sleek forms illuminated by the dim light. "They're here," Luke said, his voice grim as he grabbed his radio. "All units, prepare for engagement. This is it." The facility erupted into action as soldiers scrambled to their positions. The modified cannons were brought online, their barrels aimed skyward. Luke joined Caleb at one of the stations, the two working quickly to ensure the weapon was ready. The first ship opened fire, its energy blast tearing into the facility's outer defenses. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with the sound of alarms and shouting. Luke gritted his teeth, his focus unwavering. "Caleb, lock onto that lead ship," Luke ordered. "On it," Caleb replied, his fingers flying over the controls. The cannon fired, the modified round streaking through the air and striking the ship's shields. The same ripple effect occurred, the energy field collapsing as the vessel systems overloaded. "Target down," Caleb shouted, his voice triumphant. But there was no time to celebrate. The other 2 ships retaliated with brutal precision, their weapons carving through the facility's defenses. Luke grabbed his radio, shouting over the chaos. "Lucas, get those engineers to focus fire on the second ship. We can't let them take us out one by one." Lucas's voice crackled through the calm. "Copy that, sir. We're on it." The battle raged on, each moment a test of their resolve and resourcefulness. One by one, the ships fell, their once impenetrable forms reduced to smoking wrecks. But the cost was high. The facility was in ruins, and their numbers had dwindled. As the last ship crashed to the ground, the surviving soldiers let out a weary cheer. Luke leaned against the cannon, his body trembling with exhaustion. Rogers approached him, his face lined with grief and determination. "We did it, Captain. But this is far from over." Luke nodded, his gaze distant. "They'll keep coming. but now we know we can fight back." He looked around at the battered survivors, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the burning wreckage. They were bruised and bloodied, but they were still standing. For the first time since the invasion began, Luke felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: hope.